Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and it's part 2 of my Rastakhan's Rumble card review. Today, 2 new Rastakhan's Rumble cards were revealed. I also have one last card with timeout that I haven't quite gotten to for a full review yet. So in total, we have the 3 cards you see here on your screen up for review today. That said, if you're short on time, you can hit the quick reviews at the end of the video using the link in the description. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into the detailed reviews. Up first here, I have Ticket Scalper, a new neutral pirate coming in at 4 mana. It's got 5 attack and 3 health, and it has Overkill, of course, the new keyword for Rastakhan's Rumble. Just a quick review because a lot of people ask me this. Overkill means if this minion does more damage than necessary when killing an enemy minion, it will trigger this effect. So for instance, if Ticket Scalper attacks into a 3 health minion, it would do 2 extra damage, thus activating Overkill, drawing it 2 cards. Now, it's not based on the number of extra damage. It's just in this scenario, a yes/no. Does it activate Overkill or not? So if it attacks something with 4 or less, it would activate Overkill. Otherwise, it wouldn't. So clearly in this case, drawing 2 cards is a fantastic result. Getting 2 cards out of a 4 mana card's wonderful, particularly when it's attached to a pretty strong body here with a 5/3. That's a lot of total stats. That's 8/8. With this good of an upside, that's strong. Compared to something like Elven Minstrel, for instance, that's a 3/2 that draws you 2 cards and is a widely played card. Now, of course, the distinction there between those 2 cards is that Elven Minstrel can do it more consistently and reliably. You can control when it is going to draw you cards. Ticket Scalper, you're a little bit more just up to the whims of the game and your opponent because it may not always work. Sometimes you'll play this down and your opponent will kill it before you get the chance to draw any cards. Now, also of note, Overkill only works on your own turn. So if, for instance, your opponent trades a 3/3 into Ticket Scalper on their turn, that's not going to activate the Overkill. Even though your minion did more damage, it's during that attacking phase that was confirmed by Blizzard in their panel. Overkill reads specifically when your minion does extra damage on your turn. So only when you're attacking with this thing. So as a defensive play, if you're just dropping it on the board, it's rather susceptible, which is going to reduce the consistency of how often this Overkill goes off. And in fact, often mean it might not go off at all. So at that point, is a 4 mana 5/3 worth it? If you don't get the card draw, or are just those occasional opportunities where you get the card draw going to make up for the other times where it doesn't? And that's really the crux of whether or not this card is going to be good. And I will say that I think it still has a chance to be rather strong. The reason for that is because pirates and pirate synergy decks are often more aggressive because most pirates are low-cost cards that get out onto the board quickly. And something like a strong 5-attack minion to follow up on turn 4 will occasionally stick because your opponent has exhausted all their early minions or some early removal on your previous early game pirates, and by the time you drop Ticket Scalper, you might be playing it onto an empty board where your opponent doesn't have a minion. They might have already used their Frostbolts and so on to kill all the previous South Sea Captains and stuff you played, and then the Ticket Scalper sticks and it gets to take a trade. So I do think there are going to be instances where it's very possible to get this Overkill to work. Now, will it work multiple times? That's a tougher question to answer. That seems unlikely to me because by the time you hit turn 4, most minions you'd be trading this into are often going to have 3 attack or more. So getting multiple instances where it can actually attack twice seems incredibly unlikely. It's also worth noting that apparently it's been confirmed that even if the minion dies during its attack, as long as that Overkill happened, it will still activate the card draw. So even if you do take a clean trade with it, as far as its health total is concerned, you might still get 2 cards, which is great for an aggro deck that's dumping early game pirates and early resources onto the board. That has a lot of potential to be good because you need to refill your hand if you're playing lots of cheap cards. So clearly something that does synergize with the pirate style, has a reasonable stat line, has tons of upside when it works. It's just that question of consistency. Will this thing find a meta where it has time to attack, minions it can attack into safely, and a deck that can properly support it, or even a meta that doesn't have tons of Hellfires, for instance, because a card like this just loses really hard to Hellfire. So that's the challenge, and it's a tough challenge. And I think that's the reason this card's going to be okay and playable, just not particularly dominant or a staple in the meta. Moving on, let's talk about Heavy Metal here for Warrior, a new 6 mana spell. It reads, summon a random minion with cost equal to your armor. So this is a bit like the effect we've seen in the past with Geosculptor Yip, where it summons a minion. Geosculptor Yip does the exact same thing with the cost equal to your armor up to 10. So of course, if you had 10 plus armor, you'd be summoning 10 drops, things like Deathwing or Mechathune, these really, really big, scary minions. It also perhaps reminds you of something like Spiteful Summoner in the past, where you could get those 10 mana minions out consistently on turn 6 pre-nerf or turn 7 now. And we all saw how powerful Spiteful Summoner was at 6 mana. In past metas, you'd get that giant body and your opponent just wouldn't have an answer, and you'd just run over them with lots of pressure from a big minion. But for a lot of reasons, it should become apparent how Heavy Metal in and of itself is not as good as an activated Spiteful Summoner. Because first off, you don't get a 4/4 body on the Spiteful Summoner. And beyond that, you don't always have 10 armor. It's not technically that consistent. And although Spiteful Summoner, of course, requires you to compromise the integrity of your deck, Heavy Metal has the same sort of consistency issues because you're not always going to have 10 armor reliably. You might need to combo with other cards to get to 10 armor. Beyond that, I think there's a bit of a play style problem here where the sort of deck that would want to play a really powerful big minion on curve on turn 6. So think of those Spiteful Summoner decks in the past. What did they do? They played lots of minions. They curved out. They kept the pressure going in the early to mid game so that your opponent was constantly on the back foot, constantly trying to keep up, trying to remove. And then eventually, by the time you dropped that Spiteful Summoner, they'd just be out of stuff. They wouldn't have the removal. The pressure would eventually just overwhelm them and they'd cave. And that's how that deck would win games. Heavy Metal, unfortunately, if you try to follow that same game plan for a card like this, where you curve out, you play minions, you apply that early to mid game pressure, you're not going to have time to accrue any armor. So it's not going to serve as that curve finisher that Spiteful Summoner did, where that's the breaking point, the tipping point where you finally beat your opponent and overwhelm them with a big 12/12 Deathwing or Tyrantus or whatever it might be. This doesn't work in that way because of the fact that you need the armor to activate it. And what that means is you have to shift the style of play for this card a little bit. So suddenly, is this maybe run in more of a defensive deck, right? Because you know, defensive decks like armor. They tend to build armor. Clearly, you can't run it in an odd warrior deck where you have the Baku hero power, so that's out of the question. But there are still ways to play a more control-oriented warrior that doesn't rely on Baku or Again necessarily. This, of course, could work in Again deck, but maybe that's a path too. Maybe you just hit that armor button a lot because it's only 1 mana, and then eventually on turn 6, you play something big. But again, if you're in that slower, more control style, is one big minion in the mid game going to contribute to your game plan? Does that really help you win the long game or the fatigue game? I don't know that it does. So to me, this feels awkward where it's like somewhere in the middle where you've got like a recruit warrior world. You know, there are other recruit style cards that maybe cheat out big minions into play. And instead of trying to like curve out and pressure like a Spiteful deck, maybe it's more about just kind of keeping even until the mid game and then just swarming with a lot of big things all at once on like turn 6, turn 7, turn 8, and just, you know, kind of flipping or countering with counter pressure in that mid to late game scenario, as opposed to the traditional Spiteful style. Maybe there's a way to do that where you just have 4 or 5 really big turns in a row and your opponent just caves under all that pressure and it just looks a little different. And that could work for a card like this. Now, what I'm essentially saying is clearly getting a 10 mana minion for 6 mana, that's a good play. If you get a Tyrantus for 6 mana, you're super happy about that. Mechathune's probably solid too. Deathwing's good. But when I compare that to past examples of cards like this that have worked well, and when I try to slot it into a deck, it doesn't line up all that well for me. I think it's going to be a bit of an awkward card to play, and in a way is almost at odds with itself as far as how you achieve this condition and then the reward for this condition. They don't really go together in my mind. They kind of go counter to one another. So that's why I think Heavy Metal, clearly in a vacuum, if it works, you're excited about the result, but a card that's going to have trouble seeing any sort of real impactful play in Hearthstone. And then finally, Timeout. Now, I will say for this card, I've already talked about it at great length in a previous video here on my channel. If you want to go check out, I discussed Timeout in comparison to Ice Block in great detail, like 12 minutes on this one card. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it today. Essentially, the conclusions I made in the previous video were that a card like this clearly has some stall potential. It can set up some neat opportunities for Paladin taking trades with weapons, denying damage for a turn or two, doing things like enabling combos, helping you find time in a control deck to just draw into healing or removal. So clearly the sort of card that has that potential, but not as reliable or consistent as Ice Block. Also a little bit more punishing from a tempo standpoint compared to Ice Block, because you do have to spend this mana at the time it's most important, and you have to time it well as well. So more challenges with a card like this than something like Ice Block, but also in some ways more utility or more opportunity, and still something Paladin could utilize in a certain deck archetype or style, that being either control or combo. So I do think Timeout has a lot of potential to see play. I think it's going to take a while to find a deck to make this one work. I don't think it's going to be a day one obvious card in any given meta, but eventually this card has the promise to see play for sure. All that said, that wraps it up for my detailed reviews. Now let's jump into my quick reviews. Ticket Scalper is a 3-star card. Heavy Metal is a 2-star card. Timeout is a 3-star card. And there you go, guys. Not the most exciting batch of cards, and a pretty small batch of cards today on top of that. But nonetheless, don't be surprised if these see play. Just a reminder, 3 stars mean to me it's a card that is playable. It's probably not going to be a common sight or a defining deck staple card or anything of the sort, but the sort of card that will eventually make its way into some deck here or there, which ultimately that's a good sign. If a card is playable, I like that. 2 stars means it's far less likely to see play. That's a big distinction. 3 mana cards are all over the place, or excuse me, 3-star cards all over the place in Hearthstone. 2-star cards are far rarer a sight indeed. So not the end of the world here for this review. And of course, I'm excited about future cards. I think we're going to have some cool Loas and legendaries coming soon. That said, if you guys have thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, of course, leave those all in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.